Okay, well, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me at the event and for putting me up first. That's great. I'm a little bit nervous because one of the things that I'm going to be doing is using the technology, the thought exchange technology, to really shape the conversation that we're having. And I'm not doing a presentation, I don't have slides, and I'm not standing up here as the expert on the topic. What I want to do is promise an authentic conversation that includes your input, your reflection, your suggestions on these topics. And I think we want to start by, do you want to lead that part? We want to start by getting your thoughts on the topic.
So who here has never seen a thought exchange dashboard? Hands up. All right, so I'm going to just take a moment of Karen's time, not a lot, so that you can see what we're jumping back and forth for. All right, so what we have here is that here's all the thoughts. So if you go to Discover on your app as a participant and you hit all thoughts, this is what you're going to see. So the participant has the ability to see actually how the data is being organized, total transparency. It's not like you put something in and you don't know where it fell. There's certain people who might feel like they won the exchange right now. All right? That's okay to feel good. All right? It's totally anonymous, yet when you have the number one thought, you have this desire to put your hand up and say, that was me. That's also fine. All right, so throughout the day, you might win an exchange. It's all right to lean over to your neighbor and say, I'm thought number 1 or 2. That's allowed, it's allowed. At Thought Exchange, we do it all the time. Someone's like, I won. So what's great here is to see that there's a lot of consistency in how people are feeling. What's super interesting is that we actually theme the thoughts with AI intelligence. So it's giving us themes. And why that's important is that instead of just seeing the top thoughts, because they all could be similar, they all could be about pay equity. So you see pay equity, pay equity, pay equity, that's actually just a theme on pay. It's not actually everything that's in here. So there's a theme around maternity leave, women in leadership roles. There's a theme on pay, a theme on inclusion. I haven't had a chance to deal with these thoughts that they don't know what to do with. And there's one about equity and salary and bias. So what a facilitator can do is she can go to her top thoughts, or if she wants to mix up the conversation, she can grab the top thought by theme so that we have some diversity in the discussion. The last thing, and I'm doing this so that Karen can ask me what she wants to see, is here's areas in the room where we do not agree. So there's some camps in the room. And you know, this is where the really interesting dialogue is. Some thoughts are thought number 3.2, and it's not because everybody was meh. It's because there's a group that said this is the most important thing we should talk about, and there's a group that sank it with a 1. All right, and this happens in a lot of companies. And so it looks like it's not important, but really what it is it's very, very divisive. So if you're going to have a discussion around what are the things that are dividing us right now, you want to not just look at everything we agree on, which is really fun, but also not very contentious, is to dig into this. So as an example, we did one of these in Austin, Texas with superintendents in the US, and we talked about whether there should be guns inside schools. Yeah, God help us all, right? And so this is an interesting one. So you can see here, there's some things that we're not agreeing on that she might want to touch on. And then there's some things that these groups do agree on. So this is where we're agreeing in that group. And we have different sets of groups of people who are not agreeing on things right now. So we can have a little bit of fun with that. But the first thing we like to do, because it is about the top thoughts, is dig into top thoughts. So I'm going to leave this with Karen, and I'm just here for you if you want to pull up anything else.
Yes. Okay. So how was that exercise, having your say and being able to do it anonymously? Was that good? Do you feel like perhaps you were able to express something that you might not have if you had to stand up and talk about it? Yes. And in a topic like diversity, inclusion, gender equality, it's so important for me to be able to create a safe space. And I'm already seeing that this technology allows us to do that. So we can have real conversations about things that people feel uncomfortable talking about. You know, when we were doing the introductory exercise of tell me a couple of good things about yourself, one of the things that I said was, I love sex. And I do, by the way, and I'm really good at it. And okay, and there was quite a response because it was like, oh my God, like, why are you talking about this? But this is part of what I do is to kind of normalize things that most of us feel are off topic. We shouldn't go there, because that's where the issues come up when we start creating boundaries about what's okay to talk about or what isn't, or what my truth is and what spaces I'm allowed to share my truth in, right? So the reason why I shared that with you, I love getting people all excited, but it was because I want you to know that this is, if we want to make the most of the next 20 minutes, let's go there, right? Let's go there, but let's be respectful about how we do it. So let's look at a couple of the thoughts. So the first one is double standards around women. Behaviors that are typically praised in men are seen as negatives when displayed by women. So I'd like you to just have a quick table check-in. So at your tables, talk about your experience around this topic. Is it something you agree with? Do you have concrete examples? Let's just take 2 minutes at the table to talk to each other about your experiences around this. Do you think it's an issue? Do you not think it's an issue? Okay, so before we move on to the next topic, I just want to hear from you, from some of you, whoever feels like you want to share, what were some of the things that came up for you? Anyone? We need to share a mic. Do you want a mic? I'm really loud. Okay, you're like, you're a guy. Speak up. No, just kidding.
What we were talking in our group is obviously these same issues. I'm good. I'm good. The same issues continue.
Oh,
Oh, for
for
your
video.
audio. Okay. Hello, audio.
Hey, that's a nice
the
voice.
the issue we were talking about is certainly even from a millennial perspective, like this stuff is still happening with women versus men, where women are undervalued, and but we're noticing that also there is a trend that is changing, that people are seeing a difference in the workplace where women are becoming more recognized. But what is happening, particularly with the boomers, is we're noticing ageism is coming in now, and that's becoming an issue for us. And so before it was more gender inequality, now it's ageist issues that are beginning, and that's because we're working longer, living longer, and so that's becoming an issue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do we agree with that? The perspective that perhaps we've dealt with the gender dynamic a bit better than we have with other issues like ageism? Or do we feel like we're still navigating the gender thing as well as having age and race and other issues kind of playing into it as well? What did you want to say on that?
Yeah, I think we have a ways to go still with gender equality.
Mhm.
I definitely think it's something that's happening now, especially with so many different workforces making different generations making its way into the workforce.
Yes.
But we were speaking about there's really fundamentally women do face these types of problems, especially in executive roles. And there are certain functions within an organization that it's almost acceptable to have to women in that we allow. So, human resources is one that you commonly
Yeah.
see. But if that same person was, say, the head of finance, they would probably run into some of the issues that we're talking about right now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I mean, there's so many layers to this topic, right? Because within one organization, you have different roles, like you were saying, HR versus finance, and they tend to be segregated in terms of, do you see more women or men in those departments or in that sector? When you take that to a national level, you see that across sectors. So less women in science, more women in, social work and taking care and etc. And the analysis around this is that still we are seeing a lot of gender stratification around occupations. And so there's another concern that was raised around, well, what do we do when we don't have enough women in the pipeline for a particular type of, engineering or a particular type of role, even CEOs and CFOs? Why don't we have, and I'm blending a couple of comments here, but why don't we have more women coming into this space? And so, let's just identify a couple of strategies, because I worked on this issue at a continental level in Africa, looking at women in STEM and advising a number of different governments on how do they create a strategy to address the pipeline issue. And I think there are a couple of takeaways in that conversation that can address the gap that we're seeing in sectors, but also within organizational spaces. And then we'll come back to the comment around behavior. So what are some strategies we can think of around the gap for women in or men in certain spaces or sectors? What can we do about it? Yeah.
I think we have to look at kind of your mid-level leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Look at your mid-level leaders. Take a look at your diversity there. In our organization, once we got down below the director level, then we could see diversity. Focus on those high potential leaders at that level and future leaders, and work on really robust development plans for them, giving them stretch assignments, opportunities, getting them involved. And then I think you also have to look at where are you getting your talent. So if you're doing the post and pray, that may not be
Yes.
your best opportunity.
Yes.
And I think those are a couple of the things. And then once you get them in, we can get them in, but then how do you keep them, and the turnover's higher? Why is that? So we're trying to figure that out now.
Okay, so I really like that. So first start with who you already have within your organization and create a plan and a pathway for them, to identify them, to develop them, to support them and encourage them. And in Canada, where I'm hearing a lot of conversation around mentorship versus sponsorship, and let's do more sponsorship of specific groups of people that we want to see in leadership roles. Now, we all understand the distinction, right, in terms of mentorship versus sponsorship? Yes? No? So who would like to explain the difference to the room very quickly? Because there's a couple of people who are not clear on that.
Mentorship is when you have regular touch point conversations and you give advice or give or share your learnings with somebody on their career path. Sponsorship is when you raise your hand and say, can you please look out for her? If somebody's discussing a job promotion or something, you actually put their name on the table and you say, and you advocate for them.
Right. So you're literally kind of like their agent, so to speak, right? They don't even know that you're doing it, but you're out there putting their name forward and encouraging people to consider them, etc. And so that is one concrete strategy that we can talk about is, are you doing enough sponsorship? And one of the tensions when we look at gender and sponsorship is men saying, with the Me Too movement going on and everything that's happening, I'm uncomfortable mentoring or sponsoring a woman because who knows where that's going to take us, right? And so that's something that I think we need to address when we're looking at pipeline issues and supporting women and minorities moving up is we're getting a little uncomfortable because people don't want to be in the situation where they're opening themselves up for potential conflict. But one of the reasons why we have that sentiment within organizations is because we're not addressing the Me Too concerns and discussions. And, as someone who's done a lot of sensitivity training with people who screwed up, so I've been on both sides of it. I've been the recipient of sexual harassment at work, and I've also been the person that deals with the men and sometimes women who end up, being disciplined and having to go through sensitivity training. And it's been so amazing to hear from the other side. And I'll just quickly speak to that because, I've had men say to me, there was one VP of a law firm, huge law firm, and this individual had spoken to a senior woman, and there's very few of them, and she'd just come back from mat leave, and he had said, look, I'm running a business. If you can't hit the quotas, you should just stay home and breastfeed. Okay? And she was like, well, look, I've taken a year and a half off. I've given up all my client files. I don't have an active network. You've got to give me a ramp to get back on, right? You can't just hold me at the same standard as the men who have been here and have had all this advantage. And, when he ended up coming to me, HR said, this guy is so arrogant, he's not going to sit in a sensitivity training. So we're looking for someone who'll think outside the box and get us the result, but do it differently. So I said, what session will he go into? What do we need to call it? And so we agreed on executive coaching. Okay, so we took out the word sensitivity, and I was like, whatever it takes. So we got him in the room, and then I walked in the room for five sessions. We broke it up because sometimes people need to hear the message and go away and come back and go away. So we did this over 5 sessions. And when I walked in the room, he was mad. Now, most people in that situation are mad. I'm comfortable with that. But he was really upset. Like, he saw me and he got more upset. So I reached a point where I said to him, well, can we talk about why you're upset? Because you're here, I'm here, let's do this. And he said, okay, I'll be honest with you. I saw your name, it was Karen Craggs, but you're not white. I was expecting a white person when I got this email. Okay, then I said, I totally get it, no problem, that's understandable. And then he said to me, and you look younger than my kids. I have 3 kids and you look younger than all 3 of them, so what the hell are you going to teach me? Right? And he's the VP of a company, so he's very busy, he doesn't have time for anyone, and that's part of his privilege, is that he gets to say, I'm too busy for you. And so, what I want to say when we're dealing with issues around Me Too and people being sensitive and having power dynamics and everything, it's really, really important to put the ego aside and have those real conversations especially with leaders who are part of the problem. And so what we did there is we had that beginning, and it created trust because I allowed him to speak up about what his concerns were, and then I addressed them. And at some point he said to me, what I said to her is the truth. he's right that they're running a business. He's right that, men on the team have to work harder to meet the quotas for the organization, and she's not able to meet it, so they're resenting her for it. So there's truth in his concerns. On the flip side, he also needs to understand that there are certain things that are appropriate and not appropriate, and there's language that he shouldn't be using, and there's implications and consequences for crossing a certain legal line or moral line, and that he's setting a bad standard for other people and a bad example. But the other element to all of this was culture, because what I found out in those conversations was what he had said was being said behind closed doors when the women were out of the room anyway. So he was saying, why am I being scapegoated when this is happening? Like, this is how we talk. There's nothing new about it. And so that then brought us back to the organization to say we need to change culture and talk about culture as well, right? So I'm kind of going all over the place, but what I want to point to is when we talk about things like gendered behavior in the workplace or strategies for pipeline, they're not disconnected from, our personal values, what we, our organizational culture, and what we put up with. Because when we put up with it, we're basically allowing it to continue, right? So let me move to a different topic because we have limited time. Yeah, I wanted to talk about forced diversity because this was one of the topics where there was some kind of tension in the room or disagreement around it. Forced diversity. So what do we mean, for those of you who kind of rated it and were responding to that, what do we mean by forced diversity? And is it a good thing or not? What are our thoughts around that?
Yeah, I'm guessing that is perhaps things like in the NFL they have the Rooney Rule, which means if there's a coaching opening, you have to interview at least one minority candidate. I know California just passed a law basically saying you must at least have one female on your board, and I think the challenges there are. And there are arguments for it in the NFL. Even if it's not a genuine hire, the argument is you're at least exposing folks. But I know, going back to the board thing, if you're in a California company and you are the only female board member, but you earn your right to be there, are you being perceived as, well, we're just meeting the quota, right? And so I think there's a lot of understanding as to how we need to sort of help push businesses and society along by passing these rules, but there's also a counter to it, right? I mean, I think other people have scored this. Is that pretty much the sentiment as to what we're thinking here? Yes, seeing nodding heads.
Is there anyone who has a very different perspective or interpretation of that disagreement, the point? Yes? Yeah.
So I come from the political world, and in elections, most recently, a number of the parties insisted on having equal female and male candidates. Mm-hmm. So the challenge was, of course, in a particular riding, association, or whatever, you're told that you need a female candidate, or 2/3 of your riding is Asian, mm-hmm. Therefore you need a Chinese candidate. Mm-hmm. That's a problem. Especially when there's a perception that you want the best people, regardless. Mm. Now, understanding that there is that double-edged sword, it's like, how do you give people that aren't represented an opportunity, mm-hmm. unless you put in rules? But then you get the resentment from the other side saying, I've put 30 years into this party. Why am I being told that a 26-year-old Chinese woman is going to be the candidate rather than me, who knows the file much, much better? So I think there's a real disconnect at some time.
Yeah. Okay. So I think, let me just cut to my bottom line, which is, I think in this work, we oversimplify things, and that's where we create problems, because we understand that we need meaningful representation and engagement. We also understand that in a particular historical and social context, there are individuals who need time to build up to that place, right? So we need to put in strategies to help them, like the 20-something-year-old Chinese woman. We need to find those individuals and support them and develop them and mentor them and sponsor them. In the meantime, I would rather sit on a board with 10 men who get it than 5 women and 5 men and the 5 women are biatches. Okay, and I'm saying that because I've been there. I worked at the United Nations, and there was one senior woman in leadership, and she was out to cut us down. You know why? Because she didn't want to be associated with feminism. So let's not like bring it down to, oh, we have to have 50% women. Oh, we have to have, what I want is leadership that gets it. And yes, it's important to have representation. And yes, if we can get people on the table who represent those communities, like Indigenous communities, I can't speak for them. I want to hear their perspective. But while we're figuring out how to create that pathway for them, let's also focus on what's really important, which is leadership that gets it. And if you're going to put anyone, whether it's the Chinese person or the woman or anybody else, into a dominant space that has been male-run or, is in some cases colonial or whatever it is, we cannot set them up to fail by putting the burden on them to now represent everybody else and figure out the power dynamics at the table. Last point, there's a 30% rule. You want change, 30% of people around the table need to represent that change and buy into it before any kind of meaningful change happens, 30%. So having one woman or two women doesn't do them justice. We set them up to fail. What we need, in addition to those people at the table, is education and support and safe spaces for difficult conversations to happen around this work. We have to make it okay for the men around the table to say, I don't like this, I'm not comfortable with it, and to address the concerns that they have around it, as opposed to saying, well, too bad because it's 2019. That is lazy, okay? And very finally, what I'll say is, at the end of the day, this is what I'm committed to. I created a whole new approach called conscious equality, because I feel like we simplify and we undermine the cause when we talk about gender versus race versus age versus this versus that. At the end of the day, we want to be conscious and intentional. And conscious and intentional means a couple of things. It means, one, that we understand that we are not all equal. Our race, our privilege, our historical background, our education, we are not all equal. Let's get that straight to begin with. Principally, yes. In practice, no. We have different starting points. So we need to recognize how those starting points impact our access to opportunities. Secondly, we need to understand that if we want everybody to have the same equal outcome, so now I'm talking about breaking down equality. It's not just about access, it's also about outcome. Equal outcomes starts by recognizing that we start in different places, and secondly, introduces an equitable approach, which means we look at, how do I close the gap? How do I remove the barrier for you? And your barrier as an LGBTQI is different from your barrier as a woman of color, is different from your barrier as a white man who is the minority in the room now, right? So we need equitable approaches that are intentional, that recognize that we're not all the same, we don't all have the same starting points. And the last thing I'll say is, it is doable. It is doable, but to do it, to get to the practical strategies that make a difference, we have to stop taking the easy way out by saying, oh, let's just have 50% of women in the room, because then you create problems, right? I'm going to stop there. I could do this for all day, but I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. Thank you.